And there we go. So thank you for joining us tonight. This is the very last webinar of the Community Science Long Island webinar series for 2023-2024. So Community Science Long Island is an annual educational webinar series that highlights various community science opportunities around Long Island and the importance of those projects in supporting local wildlife conservation efforts. It is hosted by the Seatuck Environmental Association, Long Island Sound Study, New York Sea Grant, the Peconic Estuary Partnership, and the South Shore Estuary Reserve. Joining me tonight is one of my co-hosts, Valerie Vergona from the Peconic Estuary Partnership. She is the outreach coordinator of that program. We're also joined by Megan Festuca of the town of North Hempstead, and our speakers, Karen Oberhauser and Annie Eisenbarger. So Karen, for almost 40 years, she and her students have conducted research on several aspects of monarch butterfly ecology. This research depends on traditional lab and field techniques, as well as the contributions of a variety of audiences through participatory science. In 1996, she started the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project, which continues to engage hundreds of volunteers throughout North America. As directors of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum from 2017 through 2023, Karen built up a strong citizen science program that incorporated this program and many other projects to engage the public in meaningful ecological data collection. She has also worked with teachers since her oldest daughter started kindergarten in 1992, using monarchs and the connections people feel for this amazing insect to promote greater understanding of science and conservation. Karen has authored over 100 papers on her research on monarchs, insect conservation, and science. She has an undergraduate degree in biology from Harvard University, a degree in science education from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in ecology and behavioral biology from the University of Minnesota. Annie Eisenbarger has worked in the field of education and outreach for over 2 decades. Science is her favorite subject to learn about and teach, particularly ecology and conservation. She loves interacting with people and fostering a connection between them and the natural world. Annie's undergraduate degree is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her master's degree is from Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Since 2021, she has been working with citizen science projects at the UW-Madison Arboretum. In her current role as the Arboretum Citizen Science Coordinator, Annie facilitates citizen science projects ranging from dragonflies, monarchs, and birds to water quality studies and fungal diversity. She is captivated by monarchs, with 5th instar caterpillars ranking at the very top of her favorites list, and she is excited to be here with you talking about the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. So before I hand over the mic to them, just letting everyone know, this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be available along with all the others from the series in our website, which Valerie is adding to the chat. And if you have any questions throughout this, any of these presentations today, feel free to either put them in the chat or click the button below where it says Q&A and leave those. And at the very end of this webinar, we'll have a Q&A session with our speakers tonight. So without further ado, Karen, over to you.
All right, thanks for that great introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's wonderful to be with you. We appreciate the invitation and are really grateful to Megan, who's going to work with you in person at a workshop later after this. So really tonight is just to whet your appetite for monarch butterflies, just to talk about what amazing insects they are and how you can get involved in helping to understand them. So you're not going to learn everything tonight, but hopefully it makes you want to learn more. So I'll be starting off just talking about monarch biology and conservation, and then Annie will talk to you about the citizen science project that we'll be covering. So I want to start with an acknowledgement, because much of what we know about monarchs is thanks to citizens / community / participatory scientists all over North America. So this is just a shout out to everyone who's provided data to help us understand monarchs, and representing all of those people on this slide are my parents who've been involved with the MLMP since its inception about 25 years ago. All right, so Annie's running the slides tonight, so you'll hear me with a few awkward next slide. So thanks, Annie. So I'm just going to start with a really basic background on monarch butterfly biology. They're amazing, interesting creatures. So the next slide starts with the individual life cycle of monarchs. So what happens to one monarch as it goes through its life? So it starts life as an egg. It's an egg for roughly 4 to 5 days, depending on temperature and normal conditions. Then it's a caterpillar or a larva, and it's a caterpillar for 9 to 13 days. Again, longer if it's cooler, shorter if it's warmer. And then it's a pupa or a chrysalis. And it's a chrysalis for about 1 day less under the same environmental conditions. It's a chrysalis for about 1 day less, and it's a caterpillar. So the caterpillar stage is when it does all of its growing and eating. And the chrysalis stage is when it changes from a caterpillar into a butterfly. So the next stage is the adult butterfly. And the amount of time that it's an adult depends on when it lives. If it's an adult butterfly in the spring or summertime, it lives for 2 to 6 weeks. And if it's in the last generation of the year, or it emerges at the very end of the summertime or early autumn, it is an adult for 8 to 10 months. And this is the generation that migrates to Mexico, or if it's west of the Rocky Mountains, it migrates to sites along the coast of California. So the next slide shows you the importance of milkweed to monarchs. Monarch caterpillars only eat milkweed, but there are over 100 milkweed species that are native to North America. And here in the United States, we have 72 species of milkweed. And what's important about these plants is that they contain chemicals called cardinalides, which makes monarchs distasteful to or even toxic to a lot of predators. So it's really important that they eat milkweed. And this slide just shows you the variety of milkweed types that we have in North America. I'm not going to go through all of the species, but the ones that you would see in the northeastern part of the United States are starting at the top middle one. The one on the top middle with the white flowers is called whorl milkweed. That would be native to your area. And then the next one in the upper right is common milkweed, which, as its name implies, is very common. And the next one down, if we go clockwise around this circle, is swamp milkweed, which will grow in wetter areas. And then the last one I'll mention is butterfly weed with the bright orange flowers on the bottom. That's a beautiful plant to have in your garden. A lot of insects like to nectar from it, but it's also a host plant for monarchs. So you can see a wide variety of milkweed species are available to monarchs. And then the next slide shows us the adult butterflies. Now, if we were all in a room together, I could ask you if you know which one of these is the male and which one is the female. So I'll give you a second to kind of compare them in your heads before I tell you the answer. And the answer is that the one on the right is the male. And Annie, if you could just circle the dots on the male's hind wings, it's those two dots that distinguish the male from the female. So mostly they look a lot alike, but the male has these distinguishing dots, which in a lot of closely related butterflies emit a pheromone or a chemical that's attractive to the female and convincing her to mate. We think that they're not very important. They're sort of vestigial in monarchs, but they still have them. And the next slide shows us that as adults, monarchs are generalists rather than specialists. So the adults can nectar from many different flowers. What's important is that we have flowers available to them throughout their cycle. So here I've just represented a lot of the not closely related species that monarchs can nectar from. And I included one non-native plant on this. The top, the one up here with the purple flowers is lilac. Lilacs are not native to North America. They're from Eastern Europe and Asia, but they're a great nectar source for butterflies coming back in the spring. So I just wanted to emphasize that they will nectar from non-native plants. And the next slide kind of switches gears here. So we're going to talk about the annual cycle of monarchs. What happens to the whole population over the course of the year? And the next slide shows you a map. And it's a little dull to see black lines on the slide, but it's the easiest way for me to talk you through their annual cycle. So the map on the left shows monarchs during the fall, where monarchs are during the fall. So that last generation of the year that emerges at the end of the summer and early in autumn migrates through the southern United States to central Mexico, where they'll spend the winter. There are a lot of sort of different lines going on here. And we don't think of monarchs as migrating like along flyways. Basically, you can think of monarchs as a wave of individuals that are moving south. And your monarchs in eastern New York actually migrate along the coast, the Atlantic coast. And some of them actually miss that turn to the west and fly down into the peninsula of Florida, where they join a continuously breeding population in southern Florida. But most of your monarchs turn to the west there and join the rest of them along the Gulf Coast and then ending up in central Mexico. And most of our focus, because we're from the eastern part of the United States here, most of our focus will be on this eastern population, but there is a separate population west of the Rocky Mountains that migrates to sites along the coast of California. So these monarchs migrate starting in mid-August and start arriving in the overwintering sites in Mexico in early November, late October. And then those very same butterflies next spring, so starting about a month ago, starting in mid-March, start migrating back north into the southeastern quarter of the United States. And then their offspring continue the flight back. So the butterflies that you'll be seeing in, I'd say, a little over a month in Long Island will be the next generation of the year. And then they'll go through 2 to 3 non-migratory generations, and then the cycle will start again. So this is a cycle, but one of the reasons that we know so much about monarchs is, if you click one more time, Annie, they're all together, or most of them are together during the winter, so we can tell what's going on with the monarch population. So the next slide shows you what monarchs need during each stage of this annual cycle. So as they're migrating south, they need places to stop at nighttime because they don't migrate at night. So this picture was taken in northern Mexico. This is a mesquite tree that monarchs are gathering at nighttime on their way south. And they also need nectar. So they need to eat during their migration. And once they make it to Mexico, their job is basically to stay alive. So they need safe sites for wintering in Mexico. And then as they start back north, what they're doing right now is they're flying north, finding milkweed along the way, and they'll just basically move into an area when the milkweed is up. So you can see this butterfly laying eggs on little tiny milkweed plants. That picture is in Oklahoma, where a lot of them are right now. And they need nectar. And then when they get to where we are in Wisconsin and New York is when the population builds up. So this is when they go through those 2 to 3 generations. They need lots of milkweed and lots of nectar plants. So this is a cycle, and every part of the cycle is important. So you can click 2 more times, Annie. And just to show you that the base of this cycle is what happens in our breeding populations in the northern part of the United States, where in southern Canada, where monarchs are going through those generations, growing on milkweed plants. And that's the focus of the MLMP. So the next slide shows you that there are lots and lots of projects, a lot of opportunities for people to monitor monarchs. This is just one of them. But basically, the point of this slide is to show you that there are programs monitoring monarchs throughout the entire annual cycle. And what you're doing is what we'll be talking about tonight is the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. And just to let you know that that's just one of many other projects that are available to you. All right, so this is one of the other projects. It's one that Annie and I have both worked on quite a lot. It's called Journey North. So you can learn more about that. This is the only slide I'm going to show you. The migration isn't complete yet this year, but this is the migration from last year, showing you as monarchs move north out of Mexico, and the darker the green dots are, the later in the season. And each one of these dots represents somebody seeing their first monarch of the year. So we can actually track the monarchs as they move north. So it's a great way to see what's going on before they get to us. All right, now the next slide, and just a couple slides here on what's going on with the population. So we're kind of shifting gears, thinking about conservation. So monarch numbers are declining. And the next slide shows you how we keep track of what's going on with monarchs. I showed you that the little circles on that map before, when all the monarchs are together. For the population in the eastern United States, we measure how well they're doing by the area that they occupy in Mexico. So we don't measure monarchs in numbers of monarchs, we measure monarchs in hectares. So the number of hectares of land that are covered with trees, covered with monarchs, like you see in this picture. So you can see that there's a decline in the number of monarchs. And just if you're used to thinking in acres, a hectare is about 2.5 acres. So that can give you a sense of how large this area is. You can see that over time there's been a decline, but there's also a lot of annual fluctuations that are driven by weather. But we have this long-term decline, which we can kind of think about in terms of decade averages. And each one of these decades is important. So the last decade, the numbers are lower, but almost it's under 3 hectares of land has been covered, with a lot of variation, but not a either downward or upward trend. If we just take these 10 years, monarchs are not going up or down. They're low. We wish they were higher, but they're not declining. We had a really low year this year, but the important decade is the decade before this one, when the average was about 3.5, but this is when the big decline happened in monarch numbers over this decade, when they were losing a lot of habitat. And a lot of the habitat that they lost was in agricultural fields where there used to be milkweed growing, but that milkweed is gone now because of crops that have been genetically modified to withstand the application of herbicides. So this is when the big decline happened. And then the decade before that was a ton of fluctuation, but not really any trend in that decade. So this is what's going on with monarchs. And what we know about this, and I'm not going to go into a lot of details besides just this slide, but we know the 2 important things that are affecting monarchs, and that's the loss of breeding habitat and bad weather conditions. And so breeding habitat loss and hot and dry weather are both associated with lower monarch populations. So knowing that there's a decline and knowing what drives monarch numbers from one year to the next, what can we do to help them? So the next slide just starts talking about some of the space that's available to monarchs. So in addition to monitoring monarchs, by providing space for them in your area, you'll help them. And one source of possible habitat is urban and suburban spaces. So this used to be my yard where I lived in Minnesota before I moved to Madison. It was great monarch habitat. If you click again, Annie, you can see Sometimes I would come home from work and there would be 10 or 20 monarchs. This is on ironweed in this garden. But the next click shows you what a lot of urban and suburban spaces look like. And this is not good habitat. This is basically not good anything habitat. So what we want to do as much as possible is get rid of lawns and make them more useful for other creatures. Basically, this is a habitat full of an invasive grass. It's Kentucky bluegrass, which is not native to where most of us live. And the next slide shows you other sources. Another source of habitat is agricultural set-aside land. So this is a prairie strip in Iowa, planted with prairie plants next to cornfields. There are some risks from being next to cornfields if insecticides are used, but it's better than no habitat. The next slide shows another kind of habitat would be rights of ways. So these are these long linear habitats along roadsides or power lines or railroad tracks that can be good habitat. But we have to remember with the next click that often that land right next to the road is mowed. So we really don't want to put a lot of milkweed where it's being mowed. And then finally, another source of habitat is land that's protected. So this is land that we're not going to lose due to development because it's protected. So this would be city parks or county parks, anywhere that land isn't going to be dug up to make parking lots or buildings. So land that's protected, we can make better for monarchs. So as individuals, this shows you things that you can do. You can create habitat. You can join the MLMP, and that's what Nancy, or I mean, sorry, Annie, what Annie's going to talk to you about in a minute. So joining this project or other ones like the Journey North that I talked about before, which is run by somebody named Nancy. That's why I just said Nancy. You can support conservation organizations. Now, after this 10-minute description of monarchs, you're an expert on monarchs. You can spread the word. And really importantly, you can do what you can to mitigate climate change. So I'm going to shift just to say here that habitat restoration is a really important tool right now for conservation. And this is a quote that I just love. I'm not going to take the time to read it all because I have 30 seconds left here. But this is a way for us as conservationists to go on the offensive and instead of just saving land, restoring some of the land that's been lost. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Annie. I'm not going to answer any questions now, but we'll have time for questions after Annie's talk. And thanks for running through those slides so well, Annie. That was great.
No problem. All right, so I'm going to shift over to my slides here. Bear with me just a second. All right. Thumbs up, you can see. Awesome. Thanks, Karen, for the thumbs up. All right, everybody. So welcome. I'm so happy to be here with you representing the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. As you heard a bit about Karen and her bio and also in her talk, I have been fortunate enough to become part of this incredible project while working with Karen at the UW Arboretum. So not only do I get to work with an expert in the field of monarchs, but I also get to work on this very, very cool project as one of my many at the Arboretum. And today I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview about the MLMP. I'm going to tell you a bit more about the data collected by volunteers in this project over the past quarter of a century and counting. And I'm also going to tell you a bit about the nuts and bolts of the program and how you can get involved. So first, I'm going to give you that overview of the MLMP and just tell you a little bit more about what's involved with becoming a volunteer with the MLMP. So the MLMP started back in 1997, as I mentioned. You are going to have an opportunity to participate in the MLMP as long as you have a site where milkweed is growing. So as Karen referred to. This could be gardens, parks, roadsides, prairies, just some place that has milkweed. You will once a year be asked to describe your site and just tell us where it's located, how big it is, what type of milkweed grows there. And then you go out, and the bulk of what you would be doing is doing some weekly monitoring. So this once per week is an ideal. You still, of course, can go on vacation. You could have someone take over for you or go out every 10 days, whatever works for you. We'll just be happy with whatever data you can provide. I've noted with an arrow here that the monitoring activity we're going to talk about the most tonight, as well as the one that you would be spending the most time likely on with the MLMP, is estimating monarch densities. I also wanted to make a note that you can share non-site reports as well with the MLMP. So if you visit other places or make observations in a space that isn't your particular site, then just go ahead. You can also share that with us as well without having to set up a site. It's really up to you how much you monitor with the MLMP and how much you want to learn and get from this project. So the scope of the MLMP is vast. The program consists of long-term data from sites all over North America, primarily in the United States. And many of these sites have been monitored for many, many years. Like I said, it started in 1997 with 25 of those sites, with 25 sites, and then 6 are still being monitored today, but now we're up to over 1,000 different sites. You can see them represented on this map with the red dots. So now a little nitty-gritty about the detail of the data that you would be collecting and what that means and looks like. So activity 1, like I mentioned, is the monitoring activity that we're going to focus the most on. Basically, each week when you're collecting this per plant density of monarchs, you can see that along the y-axis, there's it shows monarchs per milkweed, whereas the x-axis talks about or shows the week that you are observing. In this particular graph, you can see that the first generation offspring are represented here with the numbers dropping off a bit when those monarchs from the south die off. And then the second and third generations are the ones that kind of take a peak then up again throughout the summer. The blue color, you can see the key along the side here, but the blue color represents eggs. And that's why you see more of those eggs represented here than the other colors. So in addition to being able to look at this particular year, we can also take a look at year-to-year data among the data collected in the graphs that are available to our volunteers and researchers on our site. So in this particular case, you can see in 2012 here in Wisconsin, spring came a bit early. So we have monarchs in the upper Midwest early on, but then there was a very bad drought that summer. And so the numbers really dropped off. As you can see in these July and August months, it was really a bad year for insects in general. 2019 was a pretty average year, but then in 2020, there was a year where spring wasn't so great. But favorable weather later in the summer actually meant that the population grew back up again after a slow start in the spring. So again, really awesome that you can look at this year-to-year comparison among sites and states. I pulled a couple of graphs here from a site on Long Island, the Clark Botanic Garden. So you can see here the 2023 site data on the left, and then the 2022 site data on the right. So these data are all available on the website, and they just provide a lot of opportunities for data analysis, whether that's for the volunteer or for researchers comparing year to year or state by state or site by site. So you can really dig in and find a lot of information from the data portal that is made possible from the data that's collected by the volunteers. So participating in a project like the MLMP has so many benefits associated with it. One of these are the educational benefits that you can probably off the top of your head start to think about just as we're describing the possibilities here. So you have this opportunity to engage in authentic science as a citizen scientist with the MLMP. So this science is really impactful for what we know and can understand about the monarch population, and then further to conserve and protect it, as Karen showed you in some of her slides earlier. Also, of course, we have the opportunity to collect data that will help us make connections to nature. So these relationships, as my bio said, between people and the land are, showing that interconnection between the two, and we will conserve what we protect, conserve and protect what we know and love. So just a great opportunity to get connected to nature this way. And the data that's collected makes a huge difference in our understanding and the research of monarchs for learners of all ages. Educators use this data, scientists use this data, researching big questions, searching for conservation solutions, policy making, and just very fascinating kind of long-term data set that has a lot of potential for learning and informing our knowledge of the population. Another set of benefits that goes along with being part of the MLMP is more conservation focused from a human capital perspective. So one thing that comes from this is an increased concern about nature and habitat. Like I said, we kind of protect what we know and love. And then a study that Karen and a colleague performed back in 2015 showed that volunteers engage in many conservation action, or volunteers who do that will further participate in other conservation. So conservation actions beget conservation actions. The number of volunteers that are able to contribute through a citizen science project and collect large amounts of data that just wouldn't be possible for a few scientists trying to collect this data on their own. So just really a huge impact that can be found by citizen scientists contributing data. So just know that your efforts, your participation, your contributions really truly matter and make a huge difference. So hopefully, you will want to contribute and be part of it after knowing that your efforts are very valued and really make a huge difference in our understanding. So now that we've gone over the what and the why of the MLMP, I'm going to just delve a little deeper into the how for the remainder of the talk. This is just a brief nuts and bolts overview of the MLMP, and there are more training opportunities that I'll tell you about in a little bit, one being a workshop that's coming up next week on April 18th. So the main hub for the MLMP is on our website, which is simply mlmp.org. There you're going to find a plethora of information, including the activities and corresponding data sheets that you'll use for monitoring. Today, we're going to talk primarily about activity 1, measuring monarch density, like I've said. And we're also going to talk briefly about activity 3, which is on estimating monarch survival. But I encourage you just to take a look at the website and kind of poke around and see all the different activities and possibilities that are on that site. All right, to be successful as an MLMP volunteer, you're going to need a few skills, a site with some milkweed, like I mentioned, and some materials. So one of the main jobs of an MLMP participant is record keeping, and really just keeping careful notes of what you observe in the field. And then that data is later entered online at mlmp.org. We have a data portal there where you will be able to enter your data. You'll need to be able to recognize milkweed. So I have a URL there for Xerces milkweed guide, but you can search that up on the internet and you'll be able to find milkweed specific to your particular space that will thrive in that area. Karen gave a couple of examples in her talk. You'll also need to be able to identify monarch life stages, and we're going to take a brief look at that next. All right, so on this center slide or center photo that you've seen in the sidebar throughout most of these slides, you'll notice, maybe you can see it now, that there are multiple examples of monarchs on here in various life stages. So here we have a monarch egg. Eggs are most commonly laid on the underside of milkweed leaves, but they can also be found in the flower too of or on the stem, or even the seed pods. Eggs are usually laid singly, but they can, it's not uncommon to find multiple eggs in one plant. And you can see that they're kind of a creamy white, sort of yellowish color. They're oval shaped. They have ridges that run vertically on them. They kind of look like a football to me. Tiny, tiny little eggs. Then there are 5 different instar stages. This is the first instar stage, this tiny little caterpillar right here. It's newly hatched. They're grayish, white, shiny, mostly translucent, and no stripes or markings. So the real indicator, if you see one of these teeny tiny first instars, is that it has a black head. If you see a black head, you'll know it's a first instar. And on your data sheets, you will be asked to record what stage of the life cycle the monarch is that you saw. So a couple of these pointers will help you when you get out in the field and are trying to identify which stage of instar you're seeing. Second instar right next to it is small like the first instar, but it has no black head, as you can see. And you can also notice that there are stripes and markings on this particular instar. The black, yellow, and white bands that we know and love for monarch caterpillars are starting to show up here. And they do have very short front tentacles. I heard someone else describe them as they look like little cat ears, which is adorable and very true. Third instar over here, we have, you can start to see that the black and yellow bands are darker and a bit more distinct than they were in the second instar. And the back tentacles are clearly visible at this stage. If these front tentacles were folded forward, they would cover the front of the instar's head. And these, or sorry, then the next stage, I'll just hop over here to the fourth instar. Fourth instars, the banding's obviously becoming more distinct. You can see the colors a bit more. But looking at the tentacles, you can see that if these are the helper when you're trying to identify them in the field, if the tentacles can fold all the way over the front of the head and kind of come a bit beyond where the head of the caterpillar is, you'll know it's a fourth instar. And then, as Jimena said, my favorites, these big, juicy fifth instars, I love them so much. They're obviously much darker in color. Their colors are becoming vivid. You can see the banding pattern is starting to become more distinct. The black bands are a bit wider and they almost have a velvety appearance to them. Their bodies are really plump, especially right before they pupate. And these front tentacles tend to be obviously even longer than the fourth instar, and they get a little bit droopy, especially right before they pupate. So now, in addition to record keeping, identification of milkweed and monarchs at the various life stages, you'll also need that monitoring site. So ideally, this would be a site of 10 or more plants. However, much you can take on and have at your site is awesome. So the more data, the better, obviously, but do consider your own time and space and how much you can monitor in that area. And then, of course, the tools you'll need, those data sheets, which are on the MLMP website. You'll need a hand lens. There are resources on the site, on MLMP website, that you can get this kit featured in the center photo. But, you know, a hand lens will help you, and then identification aids, especially as you're starting out. And those resources are on the website as well. Whoop. All right, so activity 1, like I said, egg and larva density. You're going to be recording some basic monitoring event details, including the date, times, and temperature. You'll probably have your phone, printout of the data sheets that you can find online. And this big yellow arrow is indicating some important information, that date, times, and temperature that you should record while you're out in the field. Because if you're anything like me, if you come back inside and you haven't done it, you will have forgotten. So record that out in the field. And then we're going to just dip in a little bit more about what you're actually looking for. So when you're out in the field, you're going to monitor as many as milkweed plants as possible. So you have, you know, your goal is to try and see as many as you can, but decide on how many you can monitor based on your site size and the time you have available. The more plants, the better, like we said. If you have a smallish number where you're monitoring all of the plants, you'll simply do that each week. You'll monitor every plant that you see and make notes about those particular plants. However, if you have a really large site and you're just monitoring along a transect, we ask that you monitor randomly along that transect. So don't pick the best looking, healthiest plants, because then you're no longer getting a random sample. you are going to, in order to monitor a transect, what you would do is you'd pick something in your sight line, like a tree, for example, ahead of you, spread your arms out, and only assess the plants that are along that transect, where your arms are. And don't choose a plant, obviously, because you see a larva or egg on it if it's not in your transect. So while you're monitoring out at your site, you'll be filling out that data sheet that I showed you already. You'll be looking for adult monarchs. If you see males, females, or if you're not sure, you'll just indicate that if you see the actual butterfly. You'll make a note of what other plants are blooming near your site, and as well as disturbances that might be at your site. So like Karen said, if there's been mowing going on or there's new milkweed that's been planted, you would make that note. And there's another project, kind of a separate project that the MLMP is tracking with these oleander aphids. If you would see these invasive aphids, you would just make a note of it and you'll notice them because they are bright, bright yellow. School bus yellow is how I've heard them described. So again, I can't say it enough. Always fill out that top part of your data sheet. And then the basics of recording with the MLMP for activity 1 in particular is you're recording every plant you look at, and then you're summarizing the data for easy entering down the road. All right, I'm going to kind of quickly go through these last couple of slides about activity 3. Again, you can dip in more to this on our website, but basically activity 3 for Monarch is estimating monarch survival and essentially rearing these caterpillars inside. So here's an example of a data sheet with a caterpillar that Karen actually did rear last year. And you can see that there's some information that you would be collecting about them. And you also might be collecting data about a caterpillar that you're rearing that doesn't make it because it's been parasitized by a fly or a wasp. And so there are steps in order to do that, but that's an option as well. So there's a lot of conversation about the pros and cons of rearing monarch butterflies. And, there are lots of things to consider when you're rearing them. If you are going to rear them, there are some definite pros to why you would want to, and I'll just let you read those on your own. But there are also some cons that are very worth noting and also important for you to consider if you're doing it. We ask that if you are going to monitor, you just need to make sure that you do so safely and report the data that you do collect about those particular reared monarchs. So last here, I just want to show you a couple of things that you can find and look for on our website, a couple of key info spots. There's that data portal circled where you would enter your data. And then these two pull downs, Get Started and Resources, will be very helpful for you. The Get Started tab has this training button that you can click, and that will tell you where you can get deeper into opportunities to train in more depth than I've been able to kind of give you this broad brushstroke view. So we have virtual live trainings with the Northern Region 1 actually coming up next week, Thursday. April 18th. And we also have a partnership with Monarch Joint Venture with an asynchronous course that you can access at that particular website so that you can take this course at your own time and place, that own time, in your own time and at your own pace, and refer back to it as well. Under that resources tab, there's a review training, and there you'll find different videos that go over all of the information in the kind of first initial training, and also the information that Karen and I have talked about here. So you can see that there are different topics. The red arrows show ones that we talked about tonight. So if you even wanted to revisit or hear the information in a different way, under that resources tab is where you'd be able to do that. And finally, now that you've had a brief overview, we are so hopeful that you will want to join the MLMP team. It sounds like you have a great opportunity coming up locally, and we have some training coming up. So we encourage you to check out our online training next week, Thursday. We have an 11 to 4 p.m. Eastern time window with that break at 1. You can register under that training tab on our website, or you could register for the MJB's Monarch Nectar Lab asynchronous MLMP course so that you can do that at your own pace and in your own time. So that is where I will stop and turn it back over to Jimena.
Thank you so much, Annie and Karen. That was wonderful. Before we start Q&A, I want to first introduce Megan Festuca. Megan is an environmental specialist with the town of North Hempstead, and she is the person who's in charge of the town's pollinator conservation efforts, and she's actually going to be leading the June 29th event that we have in person, where she will be, well, I'll just let her tell us. So anyway, sorry, Megan, what can we expect on June 29th?
Hi everyone, thanks Amanda. So I just first wanted to say that I got involved in the MLMP monitoring in 2019. The town of North Hempstead took the mayor's Monarch pledge with National Wildlife Federation, and one of the actions is community science. So I wanted to get involved, helping to provide data to from our specific town and geographic location for the project. So I started monitoring the milkweed in our pollinator garden at Clark Botanic Garden, and that data that Annie showed you was my data that I collected over the years. And yeah, so I've been doing that every year since. So basically from June to September, I'll go out and monitor each week. For the program in June, I'm going to demonstrate how I monitor the milkweed in that garden. Hopefully we'll get to see some eggs and larvae in person. And then I'm also going to give a short tour of the native plants that we have in Clark's Pollinator Garden, as well as a look at the native plant trial garden that I have that I also monitor each week at Clark. So I hope to see everyone there. It should be a great event. Hopefully we'll get nice weather.
Fingers crossed. Thank you, Megan. I'm excited. So we have a couple of questions. The first question we have here is the New York to Mexico migration completed by a single or multiple generations?
I can jump in on that one. New York to Mexico is one generation. So a butterfly would leave New York and could make it to the overwintering sites in Mexico, stay there all winter long, but it would not get all the way back to Long Island. It would get to that southeastern quarter somewhere there in the United States, and then its life would be over, and it would be the offspring. So one more generation would make the whole circle. But if we just talk New York to Mexico, it's the same butterfly that goes all the way.
That's incredible.
It is.
And I don't know if you saw someone in the chat recommended a book called Bicycling with Butterflies, written by Sarah Dickman. Apparently she followed that trail. That sounds amazing. So another question we have here is a question from Denise. I have a school rooftop terrace. Would I be able to grow a habitat there for the monarchs?
Yes. Monarchs do use, so I've heard from a few people, there's actually was a really cool study in Chicago over the last several years that people monitored all different kinds of habitats, including container gardens and container gardens that were in some cases on balconies. So they would be able to find the site and use it. So that would actually be really valuable to, have more sites like that spread over a bigger area to see their value. So, obviously it's a little more complicated to grow milkweed in containers because it can have really long tap roots, but it can be done and it can be successful. So go for it.
All right, thank you. Okay, another question we got here. Oh, actually, she responded, we have 8 garden beds. So it sounds like they have the setup already. So that's good.
Yay.
Do you know if there's a limit in terms of elevation from, I don't know, how high the building is?
It hasn't been well studied. So, I don't know, are you, Denise, on the second floor, how high up you are, but certainly when they're migrating, they'll fly very high, and monarchs are really good at finding milkweed wherever it is. So, you only will know if you try it, but yeah, my guess is you get monarchs.
Thank you. And she says she's in the 4th floor.
That's high.
That's pretty high, yeah. And any suggestions to get seeds? I don't know if that might be a local question, but do you have any pointers there?
Yeah, well, a good like national source of looking for seeds, there are two of them. One would be on the Monarch Joint Venture website, and they have links to a lot of native seed sources, and also the Xerces Society. That's spelled Xerces, which is a society for conservation of invertebrates. So that would have a lot of sources of milkweed and nectar plants, but Megan might actually know some local places to recommend.
Unfortunately, as a town employee, I cannot recommend any specific businesses. I'm sorry. I will say that I have tried to grow seeds, and I know you probably have different experiences, but it's not that easy. So I always put plants in instead of seeds, either plugs or actual plants.
Good point.
Denise, I would probably Google something like native plant sales near me or something along those lines. I have another question here. How long does it take to establish milkweed? I'm planting native plants in my new garden this season. Would I be able to participate in the program next year?
Yes, like Megan said, if you start your plants from plugs or even more mature plants, so you could buy milkweed plants of different ages to start your garden with, and the same with nectar plants. So it depends on what your starting point is for how long it would take before the garden would bring monarchs in. If you're starting from seed, they'd be pretty small in the first year, but definitely with this Chicago study that I was talking about before, they had a lot of new gardens. They actually studied over 100 urban gardens in this study. And the new ones, the gardens that were in their first year tended to have fewer monarchs, but they got some.
All right, that's good to know, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I have another question here. I have 3 plants within my own garden. Is that enough to participate?
I'll turn that one over to Annie.
Christine, yes, I would say, we say a minimum of 10 or, 10 or more is great, but I also think like starting somewhere and having that data is awesome. We'll take whatever data you can share. So it could be that after you have those 3 plants and see how much fun it is, you may want to plant some more because milkweed is so crucial to monarch survival, obviously. So yes, please join us, Christine.
All right. So folks, we still have 5 minutes. So if anybody has other questions, please feel free to drop them. I do have some of my own. I was wondering if you could speak to what the relationship is between monarch butterflies and native plants.
Yeah, so native plants, so as an ecologist and a conservation biologist, I would always favor native plants. So monarchs are native to North America, so they've evolved with the plants that are native here. That said, they will use non-native plants, especially as nectar sources. So, I don't want to be the native plant police and say, don't plant anything that's not native because, they will find flowers of other species. As far as milkweed goes, there is a non-native milkweed called tropical milkweed or Asclepias curassavica, which people will plant. It's sometimes easier to get in nurseries and it grows really fast and grows well in gardens. There are concerns about planting that non-native milkweed, especially in the South, where it stays around longer than native milkweed would. So it can be problematic for monarchs in the south because it's around when it shouldn't be. But in Long Island, it would die back. It would act as an annual there. So it wouldn't be as problematic there because it would be around the time native milkweeds are. But that said, the native ones are so great that I would encourage those. So monarchs will use non-native species, but as a conservation biologist, I'd recommend native ones. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. I didn't know that about the non-native ones, so definitely. I wanted to make a plug because I see people asking questions about, their own gardens. And I just wanted to say, if anybody is located in Long Island, there is a program called the Long Island Garden Rewards Program. I'll drop the link here. I don't think it's open yet, but it should open soon because spring is coming. And basically they provide reimbursements for things like native plants and for rain gardens and rain barrels. So in case anybody is interested in that. Oh, that's so. All right. Christine says it opened March 15th. All right. So another question I have, this one is I think this one is for you, Annie. So I'm curious to know, have you worked with, because this seems like an activity a person can do on their own, which is fabulous. But I'm wondering if you've done monitoring events with groups, especially with students, and if you have any recommendations for, anybody who's interested in doing it in that way.
Yeah, I personally, so at the Arboretum, for example, we have a group that rotates through the duties. So I guess you could call that sort of a group that I could see that kind of transferred over to other groups. And for us, it's a set of volunteers that share the monitoring responsibilities. And I do know that teachers and school groups do use this program. It's a great one to do, especially children are shorter and they can see the milkweed really well. So, training them to do this during the monitoring season, provided, that they're around. For us, it would be, in the summer months, has worked really well. And I know that there are lots of tips for monitoring with kids. We have some on our website that you could check out. But yeah, definitely, I think it's been used with groups. And Karen, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that more in your experience.
Yeah, I think you covered it well. It is great with kids. Um, I wouldn't recommend kids younger than maybe third or fourth grade. I've done it with fourth graders, and third graders can do it, but it definitely requires a lot of oversight. Distinguishing the larval caterpillars, the process Annie talked about, is that's kind of hard for really young kids, but it's a great activity for families. It can work at camps. We've had groups that have done it with summer camps where they have different groups of kids rotating in and out, and you'll have, each week they'll do it and they look at the data, cumulative data. So they get the benefit of seeing the progress. That's a really great thing about this project. But even though they only contribute 1 week's worth, they see much more.
Right. All right, so we are at 8, but we did have one more question. So I'll just say this one and then we can wrap up. So does milkweed transplant well if you see it somewhere to dig out to bring home, or should one just collect the seeds instead?
Well, just quick, that you should be really careful where you're digging it out from, and that you're not digging out somebody's own milkweed plants. But if it's your own land or you have permission, it does transplant. I'm thinking of common milkweed here. It has a long taproot, like a really long, feet long, but you can transplant it without getting that whole taproot. Younger plants transplant more easily. So, like if you want to move it around in your yard, or your neighbor's yard, if they have a lot and you'd like to move it into your yard, it's possible. But because you're almost always going to be cutting off that taproot when you move it, you need to give it quite a lot of water in the beginning to establish itself. So I have transplanted them successfully. Yeah, it's easier with younger ones, and it's just a little tricky because of that taproot. Some of the other species that we showed you don't have the same long roots and are a little easier to transplant, but sometimes like the swamp milkweed that we showed you or the butterfly weed can sometimes have a lot of roots if it's a really well-established plant. So, it's like transplanting anything. It's not always super easy.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, I think with that we will wrap up. I just saw another question pop in the chat. Can milkweed get a bit out of control? Are you able to answer that in like one sentence?
Yes, especially common milkweed. Common milkweed spreads very easily. If you have it in your garden, it's going to pop up all over your lawn. So it spreads easily, but it's pretty easy to like pull up if it's growing in places you don't want it. So if getting out of control, it just means it's getting more common and your yard is getting better and better for monarchs. So it kind of depends on what you mean by control and out of control.
Yeah.
The other
Depends
species
on
don't spread as much.
depends on perspective.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for coming and joining us tonight. Especially thank you to Annie and Karen. Those were wonderful presentations. Megan, thank you for coming and telling us what to expect. We're excited for that event. Everyone, like I said, this is our last webinar of the series, but it's not our last event. We do have 2 more in-person events, one of which is this event with Megan on June 29th, where we'll be looking at native plant gardens and hopefully getting to see some caterpillars. You can register for either of those events in the community science website, which I just put in the chat. As well as you can see this one once we put it up, and all other recordings of our past webinars are there on the site as well. So once again, thank you so much to all of our speakers tonight. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your night. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks. And I'd be really interested in hearing how the event goes in person. So thanks to Megan for doing that and for you for organizing it. And for inviting
Definitely.
us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both. This was wonderful.
It was fun.
Yes,
Thanks.
it was. Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.